Hey everyone, welcome to Reddit Readout. Today we are checking out Nuclear Revenge. Story 1. Food thieves at uni got lesions from my food. Please LMK if this breaks rule number 3. I was reminded of this by a post somewhere else where someone asked if they could legally put laxative in their coffee creamer at work because it was being stolen. The answer was no BTW. In first year at uni somewhere in the west of England, I lived in a large Georgian student house which had 23 under/postgrads living in it, all lads. We had 3 kitchens, but some people would raid other fridges, and I was sick of people stealing my food. In microbiology we were doing some experiments with an orthopox virus. Think of it as a much less severe version of cowpox, harmless enough they'd let first-year students use it with only masks, gloves and glasses. Anyway, one of my lab partners didn't use sterile technique on her inoculating loop particularly well and ended up with a blister on her lips. She used to heat it too quickly and create an aerosol. Eventually I was fed up with the thievery and took a little sample of said virus and added it to a block of cheese. A couple of days later the 2 perps also had a couple of blister-type lesions around their mouths which lasted a few days and meant they didn't want to go out. They had an inkling it was me, but I made some cheese on toast in front of them, while ensuring I wasn't cross-contaminating, so came away unscathed. The cheese gets hot enough to denature the virus. My food was never touched again, but I often think how risky this was. Story 2. Pervy ex-stepfather gets his just desserts, a nuclear revenge tale that took 15 years to pay off. Hey people! This nuclear revenge tale took 15 years to finally resolve, and I couldn't be happier. First, some background is needed to get the setup. My ex-stepfather, I refuse to acknowledge that he married my mother, and since my mother is deceased, I shouldn't have to anymore, is an awful man. My mother married him because she thought I needed a man in my life to help raise me. He was abusive verbally, and was just a toxic person to be around. Even when my mother and he divorced, he still insisted on trying to see me, and I had to be forced to go see him and his new wife every other weekend. When I moved away from the city he was in, due to me ending up in foster care, I didn't bother looking him up, nor trying to find out if he was even still alive. So, when I moved back in 2008, I was kinda surprised to find out he was still alive. Sorry for this lead up, but this is where the foundation of this revenge takes place. When I moved back to the city, I had worked my arse off and bought me my first car, a 1992 Buick Regal Custom. I loved that car, and I also loved helping people out, which was easier with a car. Well, my ex-stepdad knew about the car, because he had seen me driving around town, running errands for the local homeless shelter where I volunteered, taking guys to the doctor's office when they didn't want to wait on a bus, stuff like that, and he was a resident at said shelter. Through my volunteer work at the shelter, I had befriended a couple of young guys who had landed on hard times, and were just working odd jobs to save up some money to move back to their hometown, the same town I had moved back to the city from. After hearing about this, and their plans to just get a Greyhound down there, I told them no, that I would actually drive them there for like $40 in gas, saving them about $250. We made arrangements, and set a date for their departure. Apparently, my ex-stepdad heard about this, so he cornered them in the shower that night, told them that he was gonna have his way with them, and that I would be expecting the same kind of payment when I got them to that town. When they refused, he threatened to kill them, so they finally accepted. When I pulled up to pick them up the next morning, I can tell the air was off, like something had happened. Yesterday, these 2 guys were eager to leave this city behind, and now, they treated my car as if it had live vipers in the passenger seat. So, I asked them what was up. They told me they didn't know about leaving the city with me, and I assured them it would be fine, not knowing what my ex-stepdad had done the night prior. After a little coaxing, and me mentioning that the Greyhound doesn't even run to where they were trying to go, they loaded up my trunk, and off we went. I could feel the tension in the car, and it had become so thick, that you could slice through it using a hydrojet. After we crossed into the neighboring state, they asked me if I could just drop them off at a hotel, and they would try to find other accommodations down to where they were going. I said I wouldn't mind, but wanted to know what brought on the sudden change of plans. After a tearful choking up in the back seat, they told me what had transpired the night before with my ex-stepdad, and I saw red. Ooh, I absolutely despise this man. I wanted to, no, I needed to hurt him, but how? After assuring the two boys that they were going to be fine, and that I wasn't even about to put them through what he did, they finally allowed me to take them all the way to their town. I instructed them to file assault charges against him, and to make sure they submit DNA samples to the police, and they assured me they would. On the way back, I plotted my revenge against him, and that's when it dawned on me, my ex-stepdad was a registered offender for some stupid night when he was 16. He had told me before that he was caught urinating on an elementary school swing set as a youth, and had to register. That was the main reason I ended up in foster care to begin with, something about child endangerment, bureaucratic BS. I also know that he didn't register in our state for the last couple of years, because, had he did, he would have been kicked out of the shelter he was staying in, since they do a 3 times a day, 7-day a week, community outreach meal for not only the residents, but those who needed a hot meal that day, which would also include children. So, on the way back, I had informed the Office of Admissions staff that they had an offender in their shelter, and if they didn't get him out, I would report the shelter to the police. They had one of those safe spot stickers designating the shelter as a safe space for kids. Did I forget to mention that this shelter also ran a youth summer camp, and had a youth correctional facility and the library right next to it? They took action almost immediately, but when they went to evict him, he was nowhere to be seen. He had taken off, not to be seen again. Or so I thought. You see, when he vanished from the shelter that day, he thought the safest place to hide out was in his hometown, 9 states away. A smarter person would have looked up what his registration entailed, and would have known that fleeing across state lines without informing law enforcement is a felony, and it doesn't just stop at the state one left, but carries over to every state between point of origin and destination. So, he had racked up 9+ felony charges against him, just for that little jaunt. Fast forward to about 3 months ago, I get a message from the two boys on Facebook, asking me for my new number. I give it to them, and am almost immediately put in touch with a county sheriff, who had a federal agent in his office, asking if I knew where my ex-stepdad was. As I was telling both gentlemen that I didn't have a clue, my Facebook pinged. It was my ex-stepdad's wife, telling me to give her husband a chance to reconcile. Gag. A quick look on her page revealed that they were together, living in my hometown, and what's more, seriously, future Darwin Award winners here, they were living next door to the school he was caught urinating on all those years ago. I relayed that information to both gentlemen, and asked them what charges they had on him. They said they had 2 counts of statutory on him, and 3 counts of felony evasion. I mentioned his failure to register, and the day he left my hometown, he had ran to his hometown, 9 states away. The county sheriff informed me that he was calling from that county, and he wasn't aware of the failure to register charges, but thanked me for informing him. Ladies and gentlemen, that dirtbag that nearly ruined my life, my trust with other people, and my reputation in my hometown was finally getting what is owed to him, 25 to life for everything, and isn't eligible for parole for another 17 years, if he lives that long. He is better off rotting in the depths of Tartarus, for the lives he ruined. Story 3. A fitting twist, super long my b. TLDR, my mother used my grandmother's Alzheimer's/dementia to steal from her. Years later I took her house and put her on the street to recover some of the money she stole and support my grandmother. Edit 1, typos and readability, may be better. Background. I had a pretty terrible childhood. Don't get me wrong, I have heard of way worse, but it was far from healthy or normal. When I was young, my parents were millionaires, my father's parents owning several of the largest businesses in the region. They divorced before I was a teenager, and both of their lives plummeted downhill. By the time I was 16, I was living on my own. Drugs, alcohol, and addiction have long since killed them both. Neither of them ever worked a job since I was a teenager. Both of them died homeless before the age of 50. Situation. I joined the military and left town without ever looking back. As more years passed, I added more and more distance, physically and mentally, from my parents. When I was 20, I learned that my mother had been arrested for stealing a large sum of money from my grandmother, who was living on her own, but in the beginning stages of Alzheimer's. The state ended up pressing charges against my mother because my grandmother would not. The detective told me that they had to because my mom and her POS boyfriend were fueling the criminal underground where she lived. I was lost and shocked. I knew my mother had problems, but until this moment, I had always viewed her as a sort of forest hippie. This is the moment that is the catalyst for my nuclear revenge. You see, my grandmother was pretty wealthy. Terrified that she would be locked away in an old folks' home, she entertained the leeching of my mother and POS guy. The problem is that it was never enough. Even after my grandmother bought my mother a house down the street from her, she continued to rob her own mother blind. She also fed my underage sister a stream of drugs and brought her in on the con. It ultimately resulted in my mother and sister getting their first felony conviction. Grand theft and check fraud, which my mother tried to pin on her own daughter, because she was just a minor. A few years later, I was newly married with my first child and freshly returned from my first deployment to Iraq. We just completed another move across the country, and I am starting a new job at a new unit. I get home from work and have a strange short voicemail from my uncle, who is like the okayest guy I have ever met. It literally just says, "My mom is in the psych ward at the big hospital in her town. She left everything in your name. I'm flying back home." This is where I learned that the legal document my grandma had me sign when I was 16 made me the executor of her estate, power of attorney, etc. My unit arranges a very generous amount of time off to fly across the country and deal with this bizarre scenario. She lived alone in this massive house. My mom had destroyed the house my grandmother bought her, then moved into grandma's house on the auspices of caring for her. There were so many fleas inside that contractors I hired to make repairs wouldn't go inside. Needles everywhere, and for some reason, everything was an ashtray. It was an insane thing to witness/experience. I still refused to interact with my mom at this point of my life, but now that I had the keys to the kingdom, aka access to the pot o' gold, she tried to worm back into my life with a renewed vigor. I always just told her to fuck off. My grandmother, in the meantime, had been deemed unfit to live on her own. I was 23, with a new baby and marriage, if you remember, so I made the poor decision to put my grandmother into a nursing home. I fixed up the house, rented it to create passive income so she would not deplete her savings, and headed back home. Of course, Grandma is spicy and got kicked out of her swanky retirement home when she broke a coffee cup over some other lady's head for snooping around in her room. She was apparently wearing my grandmother's shoes when she got clocked. The same woman, a resident, had propositioned me in front of my wife when we were touring the facility. She was a different kind of the same spicy as Grandma. Her only option after the incident was a psych ward. So my senile grandmother moved in with my family, and she lived with us for more than 5 years until her care was just out of our capability. This is about the time that I exacted my revenge. The nuclear option. When the state filed charges against my mother, way back when I was 20, part of her restitution included a lien that was placed against her property in the name of my grandmother for a little less than $100,000. Some years later, my mother had not paid her property taxes in so long that she was about to lose the house. She called me to explain that the lien would not be paid if the house was auctioned, which I knew was not true, but I saw an opportunity. I eventually worked out a deal with her. She would sign the deed over to me, and I would then sell the house and pay for her to move somewhere else. I fly to town, meet her, and sign the deed over. She expected me to use my name and credit to get her a luxury apartment. She also wanted me to buy her a new truck, and let's not forget the moving company. I rented her a U-Haul truck and got her a storage unit that I had paid for 6 months. Then I put her and shithead up in an extended stay for a little while. I fixed up the property and sold it to the same rental group that bought my grandmother's house shortly before. I used the money to buy annuities that enable my grandmother to live in a normal house with a live-in nurse and care at 1:4 ratio. Which is amazing for her. She still might run out of money because of what my mother did, and I honestly don't know what will happen then. She's got some years before I have to worry, and she is just shy of 100. My mother was on the street within 6 months. The last time I saw her, she looked like the crazy person who lives under a bridge, she did at one point. She was covered in sores, balding, and methed out. She'd received a Social Security disability back payment of what would have been a significant amount for her. She died in a hospital less than 3 days later. Partied herself to death. The POS dropped her off at the curb and never saw her again. I told dude I would give him some money if he gave me the key to the storage unit. Somehow, years later, she had managed to keep it. I shared the loot with my siblings, gave POS $100 and closed that chapter of my life permanently. That's all for today. Please don't forget to like and subscribe.